The year was 1886, and the wagon that carried Elara Vance and her daughter Lydia creaked its final complaint as it crested the last rise. Below them, nestled in a shallow depression against the immense, wind-scoured backdrop of the Wyoming Territory, sat the inheritance that had pulled them halfway across the country. A clapboard house, a leaning barn, and 30 acres of stubborn-looking soil. It was her Uncle Silas's place, a man she remembered only in fragments of scent, pipe tobacco, and damp earth, and in the quiet, unnerving intensity of his gaze. He had lived and died alone, a fact the sparse landscape seemed to amplify. The house was a study in neglect, its paint scoured away by decades of wind and winter, its posture slumped like an old man settling into his final rest. To the east, the prairie stretched into an unbroken sigh of brown and pale green. To the west, the distant mountains were a jagged, purple wound against the enormous sky. It was late August, but the air already carried a sharp, premonitory chill, a promise of the brutal winter that defined life and death in this part of the world. Inside, the house was a mausoleum of dust and silence. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes, cut sharp angles through the grimy window panes, illuminating the simple, heavy furniture Silas had built with his own hands. It smelled of disuse, of cold wood and mice, and the faint, lingering aroma of all the lonely meals cooked on the cast-iron stove. Lydia, all of 7 years old and possessing a child's unsparing honesty, held fast to her mother's skirt, her small face a mask of disappointment. This was not the new beginning Elara had promised, but a continuation of hardship in a different, emptier place. While Lydia explored the 2 small rooms upstairs with the cautious curiosity of a field mouse, Elara located the door to the basement. It was made of thick, cross-braced planks and fitted with a heavy iron ring, more like the door to a vault than a cellar. It protested with a deep, guttural groan as she pulled it open, revealing a set of steep, stone steps descending into cool, musty darkness. The basement was not what she expected. In a land where a root cellar was a simple, shallow pit dug into the earth, Silas's was an act of profound and baffling overconstruction. The walls were lined with meticulously fitted fieldstone, mortared with a precision that spoke of endless, solitary hours. The air was still and cold, colder than any cellar she had ever been in, with a clean, mineral scent devoid of the usual damp rot. But the strangest feature was in the center of the packed earth floor. It was not a floor at all, but a gaping, circular chasm, perhaps 10 feet across, plunging down into absolute blackness. It, too, was lined with the same careful stonework, descending at least 15 feet before the faint light from the open door was swallowed entirely. It looked like a well, but there was no water, only a profound, silent cold that seemed to emanate from the earth's core. At the bottom, just visible if she leaned precariously over the edge, was a floor of flat stones and a dark opening in the far wall, a tunnel leading off into the unknown. It was this bizarre, subterranean structure that would become the axis upon which their survival and her reputation would turn. Word of the widow and her child arriving at the old Silas place traveled quickly, as all news did in a community stitched together by long, empty miles and infrequent visits. Within a week, Hiram Poole, who ran the nearest significant ranch 5 miles to the south, rode over under the pretense of a neighborly welcome. He was a broad, sun-cured man whose certainty was as expansive as his land holdings. He was accompanied by his wife's sister, Dorothea Vance, a woman whose pronouncements on local affairs carried the weight of scripture in the small, scattered community. They found Elara not in the house, but in the basement, hauling buckets of dirt and debris from the mysterious pit with a block and tackle rig she had fashioned from a length of old rope and a pulley salvaged from the barn. Hiram peered down into the hole, his brow furrowed with the kind of practical skepticism that had built his ranch. "That was Silas's folly," he declared, his voice echoing slightly in the stone-lined space. "Started digging it years ago. Said it was for a cellar. We all told him he was going too deep, that the frost line ain't but 4 feet down. Anything more is wasted labor." Dorothea, clutching her shawl though the day was mild, looked from the pit to Elara's dirt-streaked face with an expression of profound pity. "Dear woman," she said, her voice soft but carrying a sharp edge of condescension. "You have so much to do to make this place fit for winter. You shouldn't be wasting your strength on an old man's failed well. You'll need to put up preserves, salt your meat. Does your husband... Did he leave you with provision for a proper ice house?" Elara paused, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her forearm. "My uncle wasn't digging a well, Mr. Poole, and I have neither the time nor the funds to build an ice house before the first snow. This," she said, gesturing down into the cold dark, "is how we will keep our food. This is our larder." Hiram exchanged a look with Dorothea, a quick, shared glance of amusement and concern that was far more insulting than open ridicule. Amusement was a safer position. "Mrs. Vance," Hiram said, adopting a patient, paternal tone, "the ground freezes, hard as iron. Anything you put down that deep will turn to a block of ice by January. A proper cellar is shallow. It uses the ground's surface warmth. What you have there is a frost trap. You'll lose every potato, every apple you put in it." They saw a stubborn, grieving woman clinging to the eccentricities of her dead relative, a foolishness they felt duty-bound to correct before it led to starvation. Their advice was logical, born of generations of hard-won experience on the plains. They spoke of the necessity of heavy salting for pork, of drying apples into leathery chips, of the vast quantities of ice that had to be sawn from the river in the dead of winter and packed in sawdust to last the year. Their methods were a constant, brutal fight against nature, a war of preservation waged with salt, smoke, ice, and sugar. They saw winter as an enemy to be held at bay. Elara listened politely, nodding, but their words flowed past her. They were describing outcomes, not principles. Watching a thing happen, season after season, was not the same as understanding the forces that made it happen. Their knowledge was a collection of recipes for survival. Hers, inherited from Silas, was an understanding of the ingredients. They saw a deep hole in the ground. She saw a machine designed to harness a force they had never thought to consider. As they rode away, Elara overheard Dorothea say to Hiram, her voice carrying clearly on the thin air, "It's a pity. The poor thing is touched by grief. She'll learn her lesson when the first blizzard hits." Elara felt a familiar, cold knot of determination tighten in her stomach. It was the same feeling she'd had when doctors told her that her husband's cough was nothing, or when the banker had explained, with false sympathy, why a widow could not secure a loan. It was the quiet, unbending resolve that grew not from arrogance, but from a deep, solitary certainty. She turned and went back to her work. The rhythmic creak of the pulley and the soft thud of dirt landing on the growing pile outside the only answer she offered to their departing judgment. Her knowledge came from a memory, sharp and clear as a winter morning, from when she was no older than Lydia. She had been visiting Silas, a rare trip her parents undertook with a sense of familial duty. He had taken her out to the half-dug pit behind his house, the precursor to the one in his basement. He had her place one hand on the sun-baked surface of the prairie and the other deep inside a small hole he had dug. The surface was hot. The earth a foot down was cool. "The sun and the winter," he had told her, his voice a low rumble. "They are loud, and they shout all day long. They make the top of the world hot and then cold." But deep down, and here he had guided her hand even deeper into the damp, chill soil, the earth doesn't listen to them. It has its own temperature, a slow, steady breath. Always the same. The trick, Elara, is not to fight the winter. The trick is to get deep enough that the winter can't find you. Later, sorting through the jumble of his meager possessions, she had found his journals. They were not diaries of a lonely man, but records of a meticulous observer. There were pages of temperature readings, taken at different depths in the soil through every season. There were drawings of wind patterns, studies of how snow drifted around rocks and shrubs, and complex diagrams of air circulation. He had been a student of the unseen forces. It was in one of these journals that she found the detailed plans for his cellar, which he called the deep lung. The principle was simple, yet profound. Below the frost line, roughly 4 to 6 feet down in this climate, the Earth maintained a near-constant temperature year-round, somewhere between 40 and 50 degrees. A traditional cellar was too shallow, still subject to the whims of the seasons. Silas's design went far deeper, into this zone of thermal stability. The pit was not just a storage space. It was a reservoir of constant, cool air. The genius, however, was in the ventilation, the part no one else could see. His diagrams showed 2 pipes or shafts. One, the intake, would run underground for 100 feet, sloping gently downwards towards the base of the pit. Air drawn through this pipe would be cooled by the earth in summer and, crucially, warmed to the Earth's constant temperature in winter before it ever reached the storage chamber. The second pipe, the exhaust, would rise straight up from the top of the chamber, creating a natural convection current. The slightly warmer, more humid air from the produce would rise and exit, drawing fresh, temperature-stabilized air in through the long intake pipe. It was a passive, self-regulating system. It didn't just store food in a cold place. It created a perfect, stable microclimate, managing temperature and humidity with nothing more than stone, earth, and an understanding of physics. She had tried to explain a sliver of this to Hiram Poole before he left. "The depth keeps it from freezing," she had said simply. "The earth itself will keep it warm enough." He had actually laughed, a short, barking sound of disbelief. "Warm? Mrs. Vance, there is no warmth in the ground in January. There is only cold, and more cold. You're talking nonsense. The only thing that makes warmth is a fire. You build a fire in that hole, and you'll cook everything you own. You don't, and it will freeze. There is no in-between." He could not conceive of a source of temperature regulation other than the sun or a flame. His world was one of extremes. The idea of a gentle, constant subterranean equilibrium was as foreign to him as a language he had never heard. His failure to understand was not a failure of intelligence, but of imagination. He knew what had always been done, and for him, that was the boundary of what could be done. The work was brutal. For 2 weeks, Elara descended into the pit each morning after Lydia had her breakfast and her lessons. The first task was clearing the accumulated debris of years. She hauled up buckets of dirt, fallen rocks, and the skeletal remains of small animals that had met their end in the dark. Once it was cleaned down to the stone floor, she began the meticulous process of inspecting and repairing Silas's stonework. Using a mixture of local clay, sand, and water, she chinked the gaps where the original mortar had crumbled, ensuring the chamber was as airtight as a tomb. Her hands became raw, her nails broken, and her muscles screamed with a constant, deep ache. But with each stone she set and each gap she filled, she felt a growing connection to the uncle she barely knew, a silent communion of purpose across the barrier of death. The most critical part was constructing the ventilation shafts. Silas had already dug the long, shallow trench for the intake pipe before he died, a barely visible depression snaking away from the house. She spent a week digging it deeper, ensuring a consistent downward slope. For the pipe itself, she found a pile of old ceramic drainage tiles behind the barn, a fortunate remnant of some forgotten project. She laid them end to end in the trench, packing earth tightly around them, creating a continuous, 100-foot-long subterranean airway. The final connection, bringing the pipe through the foundation and into the base of the storage chamber, required her to carefully remove several large stones and then cement them back into place, a task that took 3 agonizing days of leverage and brute force. The exhaust vent was simpler, a vertical shaft made of stacked, hollowed-out logs that ran up through the basement ceiling and terminated just above the roofline, capped with a small, louvered box to keep out the snow and rain. While the physical labor consumed her days, her mind was constantly occupied with the principles at play. She thought about the flow of air, about the transfer of heat, about humidity and decay. This was not just manual labor. It was the physical execution of a scientific theory. She built sturdy shelves from salvaged barnwood, spacing the slats to allow for maximum air circulation around the future contents. She built a heavy, insulated door for the entrance to the chamber at the bottom of the pit, packing it with sawdust and covering it with thick canvas. Every action was deliberate, guided by the yellowed pages of Silas's journals. She was not merely following his instructions. She was rediscovering his logic, proving it to herself, one step at a time. Lydia, watching her mother work with a child's quiet solemnity, seemed to absorb the importance of the project, often bringing her cups of water or simply sitting on the basement steps, a small, silent guardian of the work. As September gave way to the sharp, golden light of October, the harvest began. Their garden was small, a desperate venture planted late in the season, but it had yielded a modest crop of potatoes, carrots, onions, and winter squash. Friends from her previous life, before her husband's death had sent them spiraling into this new, uncertain reality, had sent crates of apples, a final act of charity she had accepted with a humility that chafed. She prepared the produce with the same care she had used to build the cellar. She did not wash the root vegetables, but brushed the dirt from them gently, knowing the thin layer of native soil would help protect their skins. She inspected every single apple, setting aside any with bruises for immediate use, knowing that a single spot of rot could spoil a bushel. The entire community was a hive of activity, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke from smokehouses, and the sweet, cloying scent of boiling preserves from every kitchen. Elara did none of this. Her preservation was silent, cold, and hidden. On the day of the first hard frost, when the ground was white and the air bit at the lungs, she and Lydia began the solemn task of moving their entire winter's store into the earth. Down the steep steps, across the basement floor, and then lowered carefully by rope into the deep chamber below. They arranged the potatoes in shallow bins, the carrots and onions in beds of sand, the squash on the highest shelves, and the apples wrapped individually in old newspaper on the racks below. When the last apple was in place, the chamber was full, a silent congregation of nourishment waiting in the cold dark. Elara sealed the insulated inner door, then laid heavy planks over the top of the pit, packing the seams with straw and canvas. The deep lung was closed. Her work was done. Now, all that was left was to wait, and to trust in the slow, steady breath of the earth. The waiting was a unique form of torment, a test of faith waged in silence. Outside, the world was a visible testament to the community's labor. Their smokehouses puffed out fragrant streams of hickory and applewood smoke. Their pantries were lined with gleaming jars of preserved fruits and vegetables, and their ice houses were full. Their wealth was visible, countable, reassuring. Elara's entire fortune, the sum of all her hope and labor, was invisible, buried 15 feet below the ground. There was no feedback, no way to check on its condition. For all she knew, Hiram Poole was right, and her precious store was at that very moment beginning the slow, inexorable process of freezing solid, or, worse, succumbing to a dark, creeping rot. Doubt was a constant, unwelcome visitor in the quiet evenings, whispering that she had gambled her daughter's life on the scribblings of a reclusive old man. November arrived with a succession of cold, gray days, and then December brought the snow. It came not as gentle flakes, but as a furious, horizontal assault launched from a sky the color of slate. The wind howled, a physical presence that shook the small house and drove snow into every conceivable crack. For 3 days, the world vanished behind a swirling white curtain. This was the crucible, the test she had been preparing for. The community hunkered down, their homes islands in a frozen sea. For many, this was a time of anxiety. A storm this severe could trap them for weeks, and they would begin to anxiously ration their visible supplies. Elara, however, felt a strange sense of calm. Her focus was on tending the system. Twice a day, she bundled herself in every layer she owned and fought her way out to the 2 points where her cellar interacted with the surface world. She kept the exhaust chimney on the roof clear of accumulating snow, and, more importantly, she ensured the opening of the long intake pipe, which emerged from the ground 100 feet from the house, was not buried by the immense drifts. She was like a ship's engineer in a storm, not controlling the ocean, but ensuring the vessel she had built could properly navigate it. Inside the house, a quiet rhythm of survival took hold. They had the bruised apples, the small potatoes, the salted pork and flour she had purchased with her last few dollars. They were eating their imperfect, short-term food, while the perfect, long-term supply lay untouched below. Lydia, sensing the gravity of the silent process, never once asked if they could have one of the good apples from the cellar. She seemed to understand that what was below was not just food for today, but the promise of all their tomorrows. Elara read to her by the fire, they mended their clothes, and they listened to the storm rage outside. During the worst of it, Elara would stand over the covered pit in the basement. She would press her hand against the thick planks and imagine the air, drawn from the blizzard outside, traveling silently through its long earthen tunnel. The savage, sub-zero cold being stripped from it by the latent heat of the deep ground. Arriving in the chamber not as a killing frost, but as a gentle, life-preserving chill. She had to believe it was working. After 4 days, the wind died, and a profound, crystalline silence fell over the landscape. The sun rose on a world remade, buried under 4 feet of fresh snow, with drifts piled as high as the roof. It was mid-January. The cold was absolute, a brittle, penetrating force that found its way through the thickest wool. In town, she would later learn, the temperature had dropped to 30 below zero. Several families had lost portions of their stored vegetables when the frost had penetrated the walls of their shallow cellars. Hiram Poole's massive ice house had kept his meat frozen, but the sheer intensity of the cold had frozen the outer layers of his potato and turnip bins solid, ruining a quarter of his crop. The war against winter had claimed its casualties. For Elara, this was the moment of truth. With a crowbar and a great deal of effort, she pried the frozen planks from the top of the pit. A puff of air rose to meet her, and she instinctively recoiled, bracing for the foul stench of decay. But there was no smell of rot. Instead, the air was clean, earthy, and still, carrying a faint, sweet scent, like a freshly dug carrot. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her anxiety. She lit a lantern and lowered it down, its yellow glow illuminating the insulated door at the bottom, which appeared just as she had left it. Using the block and tackle, she lowered herself down, her feet landing softly on the stone floor of the antechamber. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was it. The culmination of all her work, all her belief, was behind that simple wooden door. She pulled the latch, and the heavy, insulated door swung inward with a soft whisper. The air that flowed out of the chamber was not the biting, painful cold of the outside world, nor was it the dead, stagnant air of a tomb. It was cool, yes, but it was a living coolness, moist and vibrant. The lantern light fell upon the shelves, and Elara felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. The squash were firm and richly colored. The onions and potatoes in their bins of sand looked as if they had been harvested yesterday. And the apples, each in its neat paper wrapping, were perfect. She reached out a trembling hand and picked one up. It was cold, firm, and heavy. There was no shriveling of the skin, no soft spots of decay. She unwrapped it and held it to the light. It gleamed, a perfect orb of crimson. Climbing back out of the pit, she called for Lydia, her voice thick with emotion. She sat at the simple wooden table in the kitchen, and with a small paring knife, she sliced the apple in half. The sound was a crisp, explosive crack, the sound of life. The flesh inside was white, juicy, and unmarked by the slightest hint of mealiness. She handed a slice to Lydia, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of hunger and wonder. The girl bit into it, and her face broke into a radiant smile. Elara took her own bite. The taste was pure and sweet, a concentrated essence of autumn sunshine preserved in the heart of the deepest winter. It was the taste of vindication. In that moment, she thought of Silas and his quiet, certain words about the earth's steady breath. He had been right. The principle was true. She had not fought the winter. She had made a covenant with the earth, and the earth had kept its promise. A week later, once the paths had been cleared, Constance Hartwell made her way to the Silas place. She was a widow herself, a practical and kind woman who had watched Elara's project with a quiet, non-judgmental curiosity. She came bearing a small loaf of bread, assuming, like everyone else, that the Vance household must be running desperately low on supplies. Elara accepted the gift graciously and invited her in. She said nothing, but simply went to the basement and returned with 2 perfect carrots and another of the gleaming red apples. She washed the carrots and handed one to Constance. "Try this," she said. Constance took a bite, her expression hesitant. It changed instantly to one of disbelief. Her eyes widened. "Merciful heavens, Elara," she whispered, her mouth full. It's crisp. It tastes like it was just pulled from the ground." She looked from the carrot in her hand to the apple on the table, then to Elara's calm, tired face. "How?" "Everyone else is eating wrinkled potatoes and soft carrots. The pools lost half their turnips to the freeze. How is this possible?" Elara simply smiled. "My uncle understood the earth," she said. Constance Hartwell stayed for 2 hours, and when she left, she carried with her not only the story of a miracle, but also the quiet, irrefutable proof of it. The true reckoning came near the end of February. A knock on the door revealed Hiram Poole, his broad shoulders slumped slightly, his usual certainty absent from his eyes. He stood on her doorstep, hat in hand, a picture of reluctant humility. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice low and devoid of its usual boom. "The wife is making a stew. I find myself short on potatoes. The last of ours were frozen through. I was wondering if I might trade you for some. I can offer salt pork." It was a stunning admission of failure. Salt pork was currency, but his own earth-given stores had failed him. He, the most successful rancher in the valley, was asking for a handout from the foolish, grieving widow. Elara did not gloat. The triumph she felt was a quiet, internal fire, and it needed no external fuel. "Of course, Mr. Poole," she said, and led him not to her pantry, but to the basement. She opened the pit and gestured for him to look down into the lamplit chamber below, at the neat rows of perfectly preserved produce. He stared for a long time, the silence broken only by the faint hiss of the lantern. He understood, then, that this was not luck. This was a system. This was knowledge he did not possess. Elara gathered a bag of potatoes and a handful of carrots and brought them up. Before he left, she offered him one of the carrots. He took it, bit into it, and chewed slowly, his gaze distant. He looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not a foolish woman, but an architect of survival. "You were right, Mrs. Vance," he said, the words plain, unadorned, and heavy with the weight of his overturned worldview. "I don't understand how, but you were right." In the spring, when the ground thawed and the world turned green again, they came to her. First Hiram, then others. They did not come with pity or advice, but with questions. They asked her about the depth, about the stones, about the strange pipes that seemed to breathe air. Elara, holding a worn copy of her uncle's journal, explained it all. She spoke not of magic, but of principles, of the frost line, of thermal mass, of convection. She shared her knowledge as freely as she had shared her food, because she knew that the survival of one was tied to the survival of all. They listened, and they began to understand that the earth was not just something to be broken by a plow or fought during winter, but a force that could be understood and partnered with. That summer, 3 more deep cellars were dug in the valley, each one a copy of Silas's design. They became known as Vance cellars, and the name stuck for generations. The principles were adapted and refined, but the core idea of reaching deep into the earth to find its stable heart remained. Elara Vance never became wealthy, but she and Lydia never went hungry again. Her inheritance was not the dilapidated house or the stubborn soil, but a piece of quiet, revolutionary wisdom. Her uncle had left her a key, not to a treasure chest, but to a fundamental truth about the world. By turning that key, she had secured not just her own future, but had changed the very rhythm of survival for the entire community, proving that the most powerful innovations often come not from shouting, but from listening to the slow, steady, and quiet breath of the earth.